Hi everybody, welcome to my channel. Right, what I'm going to do today is a video that's titled Obsessive Compulsive Disorder and the Horror of Intrusive Thoughts. And what I'm going to do is give some examples from my own life and the things that I have personally been through over the years. And also, I'm going to add in other things, probably leading up to that. Okay, so the first thing I wanted to tackle was this business of loss of identity. The reason why is because somebody mentioned it to me, I think, on my Facebook page, or message me about it or whatever. So I wanted to start off with this, okay? Loss of identity. Now, obsessive compulsive disorder, HOCD, or whatever form you got. When you have this condition, a loss of identity occurs, and I can tell you why. At least from my perspective. Because it's wants versus shoulds. Okay? Say for example, you wanted pizza. You come home from work one night and you thought to yourself, you know what? I fancy pizza tonight. And your taste buds are going. You want the pizza because you want it. You're being authentic. You're going with what feels natural to you. When you have OCD and you kind of lose your identity and you lose your way, it's because you're operating not on wants but on shoulds. You know, for example, if you pull out a DVD set and you know it's got like 10 episodes and you watch 5 and you think to yourself, you know what, I've had enough. But you feel compulsed to watch it to the end. So you're not really doing what you want. You are doing what you think you should do. So you're operating on an entirely different level. When I was younger, when I was in my mid-teens, I started idolizing people. Well, I always idolized people anyway from the time I was a kid, a little kid. But when I was about 17, 18, I started, I wanted to be like this celebrity. I wanted to be like that celebrity. And what I started doing was ripping off literally pieces of their personality. Okay? I was a little bit of Han Solo, right? Because he was a big hero of mine. Lieutenant Starbuck from Battlestar Galactica. George Foreman, Joe Frazier. All these people, you know, I'd watch their personalities and I'd mimic their facial expressions. Mimic what they said, what they talked about, etc. And I literally become almost like a Frankenstein's monster, right? And I completely lost my identity and who I was. And this way of behaving and this copycat phenomena that I was doing was all compulsions. I just felt I had to do them. Until in the end, I didn't know who I was anymore. OCD. A friend of mine, an old friend of mine from the time I was 6 years old, a guy called Gary. Now he was one of the most affable, easygoing guys you could ever wish to meet. But he had a very repressed childhood. And what happened with him was his core belief was, I'm not a man. So when he got to a certain age, he started literally arguing with everyone. He felt compulsed to overcome this core belief. But what was interesting with him was, I believe anyway, he has OCD without the accompanying anxiety. He doesn't suffer with anxiety, but he has these compulsions in his head. And there was a time when I was going down his house regularly, going back about 7-8 years ago. And it didn't matter what I'd say, he would have to disagree with me. He had to. And he had developed all these mannerisms. And he's a great guy, mind. He's a loving father. He's got, you know, he's a 100% good guy. But he started developing all these mannerisms that were completely contradictory of his personality. And he'd brush you away. He would do that gesture. That wasn't him. He started disagreeing with you over everything, like I've already said. That wasn't him. That wasn't the Gary that I grew up with. And on and on these behaviours would go, and they would morph eventually into something else, and then morph eventually into something else. And I can remember him saying one day, very fleetingly, that I think he'd lost his identity. I think he'd lost his identity. But do you know what? I think a lot of it comes through non-confrontational way of being. I think when you don't confront trauma, when you don't confront anxiety, for example, he wasn't really confronting the fact that, or accepting the fact that this core belief, I'm not a man. What he should have done is address that on a deeper level. In my case, I think I just suffered with feelings of worthlessness. I didn't like who I was. I had a lot of self-loathing, which caused me to rip off different parts of different people's personalities, right? But I was too young to know what to do and to address that. So it came forward in obsessive behavior. I honestly believe that trauma can actually bring OCD out. And I know clinically people might not agree with that and what have you, but I really do believe that. So loss of identity. I did write a couple of things down here as well. You know what? In my own particular case, I just became all these different people, and I went round in a circle. I literally went round in a circle, and eventually I had to come back. I had to find myself. I had to do a 360-degree circle and to find, and come back, and just the only way out of this fucking mess is to just accept who you are. And with me as well, I had an obsession with being flamboyant, perhaps, being the center of attention, being all these different things. But once I sort of come full circle, I started, am I in focus? I started, I just basically come back to myself. I come back to normal, self-acceptance. And one of the ways to do that, obviously, is through ERP, confronting who you really are, living in the moment, acceptance work, so on and so forth. So basically, in a nutshell, to wrap this up, it's all about, OCD, making you lose your fucking identity. You know, these HOCD guys, right? All of a sudden they have these urges and these groinal responses and all the rest of it. Can you imagine, and probably a lot of you can who are watching, can you imagine what that would be like for someone, you know, to be straight your whole life and then to have these fucking urges that are synthetic and are not real? They completely lose their identity. They don't know who the fuck they are anymore. Obsessive compulsive disorder. Right, I'm going to move on to the next part. Right. Okay. Do you mind if I vape? Do you think I look intellectual with my glasses? Right. Okay, enough messing around. Right. This part is about isolation, and I've covered this in a different video. When people have OCD, most of it goes on internally, right? Most of the public don't know that you're even going through it. And, you know, on TV, you know, it's known, the term mental health is known, the term anxiety is known, the term depression is known. And when people think of OCD, they think of cleaning. And I mentioned to somebody the other day, about 5 days ago, about OCD. And he went, you like cleaning, do you fella? You like cleaning? I go, fuck. You know, they so not clued up about obsessive compulsive disorder, right? Even in, I mean, this is the 21st century, right? And it causes a feeling of isolation. I'm the youngest of 8 children, well, 7 now. My brother passed away last year. And none of them understand what I've been through. I've got an older sister, right? My very older sister can't stand me, right? And I'm not particularly fond of her either. And in fact, she phoned me earlier on, and I phoned her back. And as I'm on the phone to her, she just put the phone down on me while I was in the middle of speaking. And she's done that about 10 times, right? And luckily for me, I'm actually pretty much recovered now. But she did that when I was suffering, right? And there's other family members who have been very dismissive of what I've been through. And they don't take the time to Google it. They don't take the time to understand. And so you are probably going to go through the same thing. You might have obsessive compulsive disorder, and you'll go to work or you'll go to school, and there'll be people in school giving you shit, or there'll be people in work giving you shit, and you've already got stuff to deal with in there. So the feeling of isolation is there. And sometimes it can get bad, right? It can get very bad. And the games people play, the manipulative games people play. And my oldest sister is very nice to me publicly, but deep down, when no one else can see it, she'll do sly little things. And I don't have the worst of things. There are people out there who suffer much worse than I do. So what I'm saying is that you can't expect people to understand what you're going through, because basically people don't give a fuck. They really don't give a fuck. So it's up to you, and hopefully you'll join my Facebook group where you can get support and you can get help and you got someone to talk to, because there are not many people out there who may understand your condition. But as I say, and as I've always said, you need to see a mental health professional. You know, doing exposure is good. You can do it on your own. But I would always recommend, first and foremost, to see someone first. You know, a trained pro who can deal with and calibrate your progress. So, how do we get out of isolation? Other than that, find friends, get out of the house, because the more you're in the house on your own, the more you ruminate. If you're going to speak to somebody with a bit of intelligence, and speak to somebody who you know won't go stabbing you in the back 2 seconds later. Handpick who you're going to speak to. Make sure they're an honest person, a good person. And, you know, I'm rabbiting on now. But basically, the point I'm trying to make is OCD people are probably more isolated than almost any other mental health issue. I would suggest, maybe I'm wrong about that. If you're depressed, people can empathize with it, because people have difficulty empathizing with what they don't understand. Very interesting point, right? You know, people understand anxiety to a point. People understand stress to a point, and they can empathize and what have you. With OCD, you won't get so much of that. So it's very important to seek out your own, so that you can, you know, back each other up. Anyway, moving on to, we're getting closer and closer to the meat and potatoes of this video. Right. Okay, so this is my story, or at least a big chunk of it. And this is about, you know, the horror of intrusive thoughts. Okay? Now, God, back in 2004, I took a job as a security guard. And I know I've mentioned this in another video, but I'm going to make this a lot more comprehensive, okay? I took a job as a security guard, and I worked about 50-something, 60-something hours a week. It was 14-hour night shifts, and I worked most nights. During these shifts, I'd read books. And I picked up a book one night and I read it. It was by Ken Norton. He was a guy who fought Muhammad Ali. And in the book, he had mentioned, and I think Jay, you've read this book, called Think and Grow Rich. He had mentioned in the book that this Think and Grow Rich was the reason why he beat Muhammad Ali. So I thought, right, I'll buy Think and Grow Rich. And I read it. Now, at the same time, I bought what they called Stack 2 at the time, which was ephedrine. I think it was, and there was a few other things mixed in with it. And they were designed to make you lose weight very quickly. You were only supposed to take one a night or one a day. I was taking 3. So I was reading this Think and Grow Rich, which has got the law of attraction in it, right? And I went on to read other books, and I read something like 50 odd spiritual and self-help books about the law of attraction and all that stuff. So I was popping these tablets like there was no tomorrow, and I was doing my nightly walks through all these corridors, nightly walks. And I had a breakdown one night. I was whimpering and I was looking around me, and my whole body was shaking, and I was in a state of total and utter panic. Something in my head that night snapped, and I developed all these intrusive thoughts, not like a fucking huge tidal wave of these intrusive thoughts that just wouldn't stop. And my body was in a constant state of anxiety, hyper anxiety. And I'd walk the corridors of this building, which was called the Welsh Labs. I think you can still get pictures of it on Google. ECM Squared, it was called, in Port Talbot in South Wales. And I was walking through these corridors, but once I had that attack and all these intrusive thoughts, I had to walk the same corridors, the same ways every night. And I'd get to one corridor, and I always remember I had to jump up and touch this thing. And if anybody had saw me, they would have thought I was nuts. But what my OCD latched onto at that time was superstition, the law of attraction. Can you imagine having OCD and studying the law of attraction? I thought I could make things happen just by thinking about them. It was a terrifying experience. And my mother was in her late 70s. And the fear, which I'd had from a little boy, by the way, about my mother dying, because she was 42 when I was born. So I always had that fear from a young age that I was going to lose her. So when I had this breakdown, my OCD latched onto that. And I'd walk through these corridors a certain way because I thought I'd bring about her death if I didn't. And do you know what I was like, guys? I was like a ghost haunting a building for 22 months. 22 months. Tons of intrusive thoughts every minute of every day. And I'd walk through these corridors for hours and hours and hours. I'd walk for an hour, rest for an hour. Walk for an hour, rest for an hour. So I was walking about 7 hours a night, doing the same patterns, the same way, and my whole existence becomes a series of rituals, circles. I was living in circles all the time. The intrusive thoughts were absolutely terrible. They were terrible. And it was all based around loss of loved ones. But what you've got to understand is with intrusive thoughts, and here's something to think about. See, intrusive thoughts are not so much of a problem. It's the fucking feelings that go with them. That's the problem. Example, if somebody has the feeling, has the thought, am I gay, or or do I fancy him, or do I fancy her, or whatever? It's not so much the thought; it's the anxiety that accompanies it. And I'll get more into that in a bit, because when I eventually beat it, when I actually did accidental exposure, basically, I still had intrusive thoughts. Not much, but I still had them, but they had no power over me. They didn't hurt me anymore, so I could just dismiss them. So it's the feeling that accompanies the thoughts that's really the problem. So anyway, I finished that job, and I thought, you know, I come off those tablets, and I thought, okay, things are going to get better now. No, because the damage had been done. And even although I come off the tablets, I was still incredibly fucked up. And I tell you something else I did as well, and this was horrible. I used to have this little stool, and I used to put it out the kitchen. I'd given up smoking, right? Sort of. But I said to myself, what I'm going to do, I'm going to have 2 or 3 cigarettes every night before going to bed, and I got to sit in that stool. Right? So every night, no matter what, it was a total compulsion. I had to sit on that stool and have cigarettes every night. So if I was out, if I was 10 miles away, I had to rush home to sit on that stool to have cigarettes. How fucking crazy is that? But anyway, the intrusive thoughts didn't stop. I'd become so obsessed with losing my mother that I was doing all these rituals to try and ward off like an evil law of attraction or something. Or I thought that something unseen was harming her, or whatever, right? Actually, I'll get to something in a minute. This tape recorder, this old tape recorder, it's one of those things that go on standby that gets activated by voice. After my mother died, my OCD attached itself to my cat. And when I was going to work, I used to put this tape recorder because I thought something unseen was hurting my cat. And I used to try and record this just in case she screamed or whatever. And I know, this is how fucking crazy I was. This is how crazy I got. The intrusive thoughts just would not stop about losing what I loved. I used to visualize, and this was when my mother was still alive. I used to visualize my cat getting run over on the road. And the thoughts were so unbelievably distressing, right? That I used to push the thoughts away. And I'd have these thoughts once, twice, 15, 25 times a day. And I would just push them away, suppress them, push them down. So what I did one day, I deliberately visualized her getting run over. And I played it over and over and over in my head. And it was distressing. And I cried. And I sobbed. And I screamed. And I got angry. And I yelled out in agony. My beloved cat got killed on the road. And doing ERP, confronting it. I wouldn't say I beat it because I sort of gave up for a while. But I think I got over it by about 70-80%. And now I can think of my cat getting killed on the road and it doesn't distress me. Or it does, but very little. Because I use that form of ERP to just confront, totally confront, the pain. But these thoughts were, I'd see my mother, and you might laugh at this, but when my mother was alive, I'd have these thoughts about something unseen hurting her, or an evil law of attraction or whatever. But I think I was watching wrestling, and this is how fucking crazy I was, right? I was watching, I think, WWF or something. And you know how they body slam each other and stuff? My mother was like late 70s, 80. And for some reason, my OCD just saw that and latched onto it. Then all I could see over and over and over was my mother being body slammed, right? An old woman being body slammed, and I'd see it over and over and over. Or I'd see her falling over and over and over. And I lived in a state of just heightened anxiety, hypervigilance, total and utter hypervigilance. And my OCD and my way of being was all focused around losing her. And eventually she passed away. And I thought, well, that'll be the end of my OCD. I foolishly believed that that would be the end of it. But I do believe they call it transference. It transferred over to my cat, which is where the tape recorder business I was talking about came in. And even when I first started making videos, I found it very hard to leave the house when I very first started the videos, because my obsession had gone from her being killed on the road to her being alone all the time. And I become very, I was full of empathy and considered her feelings too much and took too much responsibility for her being alone. And I went from a full-time job to a part-time job just so that I could be with her, because it's only me and her, and I didn't want her to be alone. And I become obsessed with this. I've since got over that, but she was the reason why I made the videos. And in fact, I want to introduce you to her, so hang on. This is Tammy, and she is partly responsible for the reason why I did all these videos. Innit, girl? You're beautiful, innit you? And I'm probably going to have hair all over my sweatshirt now. Oh, you're beautiful. Yes, so I become obsessed with Tammy. And I wasn't going out, I wasn't mixing. All I could think of was when she's going to eventually leave, you know, and what was life going to be without her? Could I cope? It was, these intrusive thoughts would not leave me alone. They fucking tortured me. They tortured me. Go on, girl. I'm doing a video, Tam. What also used to happen to me was to counteract these negative images that would flash into my mind and these negative thoughts, was I'd count numbers in my head. 1721, 1721, 1721, and I'd touch things. And if I went to switch a light switch off and on, I might have a negative thought you know, about something dark or whatever, and I'd counteract it, 1721, 1721, Jesus, Jesus, Jesus. And at one time, they were so frequent that, again, it was very, very distressing. And lack of sleep and alcohol didn't do me much good either. But prior to my mother dying, there was a time when I actually beat it. And it was kind of like an accidental exposure. I didn't actually think to myself at the time, I'm going to do an ERP. I bumped into an old friend of mine, right? Up in where I used to live. My old home where I lived as a young child. And he was doing carpentry work on a shop. And he said to me, do you remember the time, he said, when we were all laughing at you in school? And I said, no. He said, we were only about 5 or 6. He said, we were in the classroom. He said, and you were late coming to school and you were walking across the yard. And he said, I always remember you had a rag hanging out of your pants. And he said, we all were just laughing. And I thought, I remembered it. And do you know what it was like? It was like something out of like a psychological thriller. It was incredible. He unlocked this fucking memory in my head, and it was like something out of a movie. I can remember walking across the yard, and all the kids were in the classroom, all with their noses to the window looking at me, and they were all laughing. And I can remember thinking at the time, you know, what the fuck are they laughing at? What the hell is going on around here? It was so surreal and strange. But I went home that day, and my sister, who I hadn't really seen for 17 years, came home. My sister Alison. And I don't know, it gave me a bit of a morale boost that she was home, visited me. And at the time, I was living with my mother because I had to look after her, because she needed 24-hour care, more or less. So you had me and my other sisters all taking turns and looking after her. So that was extra stress too. And with the unlocked memory and my sister being home, I thought, right, now's the time to tackle this. And I had all these compulsions before going to bed. I had to get down on my knees, and I had to pray, and I had to say, read the Bible in a certain way, and if I got it wrong, I'd have to reread it. And I'd get back into bed, and I'd think, oh, right, okay, that's not right. Back up, back, okay, right, get up. And I'd go round, and I'd switch something, and I'd do this and I'd do that. Then I'd come back and I'd read the Bible again, read passages, go back, reread them again, and so forth. And it was 2, 3 o'clock in the morning or whatever before I was getting to sleep. But this night, after my sister had come home, after the unlocked memory through talking to my friend, I thought, fuck it, I'm gonna do it now. So I didn't do the compulsions. I switched the light off and I jumped into bed. And the feeling of fucking terror, the sheer terror overtook me. And I was crying in bed. I was literally crying in bed. I thought, this is it. I've gone and fucked it all up. I'm not doing the compulsions. My mother's going to die tomorrow when I wake up. My cat's going to die. This is going to happen. That's going to happen. My whole fucking life is going to be reduced to ashes because I won't do the compulsions. Because I'm standing up to it, whatever it is that's around me. Or, you know, I was fucking crazy. And I cried and sobbed myself to sleep. How I slept, I don't know. That is one thing I'm really surprised at. And when I woke up in the morning, I woke up, I went to the toilet, I took a piss, I went downstairs, I made myself coffee, had a piece of toast, and I realised I hadn't done any rituals. I hadn't had any intrusive thoughts. I'd beaten it. I'd fucking beaten it. And I can remember making a big announcement on Facebook. Do you think anyone cared? Going back to what I was saying earlier, nobody give a fuck. Nobody give a fuck. And but it came back about 2 months later because my mother had become ill again, and I was back. I wouldn't say I was back to square one, but I was back more or less. But I never ever took OCD that seriously after that. Not like I did before, because I knew I'd beaten it. And when I did beat it, and I was clean up here for 2 months, I realised that the thoughts were just thoughts and they had no power over me. I still had the occasional intrusive thought, but it had no emotional impact on me. None whatsoever. And it's very interesting because in that moment, when I stopped doing the compulsions before I went to bed, and I'm addressing all the OCD people, whatever type you have, whether it's contamination OCD, whether it's superstitious OCD, or whether it's HOCD. When when I did ERP, it was like stepping in front of a portal, stepping in front of a Stargate. And if you can imagine this, I want you to imagine something. Can you imagine standing in front of a portal, like the movie Stargate? But in this instance, you know that once you go through that portal, there's no coming back. There's no coming back. And you're standing in front of the portal and you're thinking to yourself, I've got to say goodbye to my old life. I've got to say goodbye to all my friends. I've got to say goodbye to all my habits and my way of living. Am I going to go through or not? And it's fucking scary to know that this is a one-way trip. That night, I stepped through that portal. I did the ERP by refusing to do the rituals. And when I woke up, I was better. And all those things I thought about my mother dying and my life being reduced to cinders, it never happened. It was all up here, all of it. So with the HOCD people, they fear being, allowing the HOCD thoughts. They fear that if they allow the thoughts, I'm gay, or the intrusive urges, the groinal responses, if they just allow them, then they will somehow turn gay. This is the fear. It's the same fear that I had before I gave up doing the prayers and doing all the rituals before I went to bed. It's the same thing. It's just a different theme. And that's exactly what it's like. It's like going through the portal. It's that scary. But once you fucking go through it, you'll be fine. Once you start doing the ERP, your life will get better. It will. You don't think it, because the fear it strangles you so badly, and it almost crushes you. It's like a weight on top of you. But once you confront it, you'll be fine. It's like the analogy that I used in, I think, my second video. It's like as if there's a city, a beautiful city in the distance, but in between you and the city is the swamplands, the marshlands. To get to that city, you have to travel through the marshlands. But once you do it, you'll be okay. Now, I have to remind people again that if you're going to do ERP, it's better to do it with a therapist. You can do it on your own. You can go back to one of my earlier videos and try it. And it might work for you. I know it's worked for other people, but you're better off doing it with a therapist. So, and I gotta be honest, the Stargate analogy, the portal analogy is a good one, because that's exactly what it's like. It's, you know, there's an old story of, I think it was a general or something, back in the, I don't know, was it the 17th or 18th century or something ridiculous. They were going to do battle with another army. So they sailed all their ships to this island, or to this land. And they got onto the island, and the captain or the general or whatever said to his men, right, we burn our fucking ships, here and now. We burn our boats. And they were like, ah, no, burn the fucking ships, all of them. Because now we have got no choice but to fight the enemy and beat him. So they burnt all their ships. So they had no source of retreat whatsoever. And they went into that fight and they fought like, you know, it's like Mike Tyson, and Mike Tyson used to fight people like they stole his bike. And they just fought with such ferocity against this other army, and they beat them. And so it is, you know, with ERP. When you do ERP, you've got to do it with a single-mindedness of, I'm willing to give up my identity. OCD, you want me to be fucking gay? Alright, fuck it, I'll be fucking gay. And go into it with that mindset. I'm going to give up my whole life. You know, I'm going to give up everything I hold dear. I don't care. I want to get this fucking thing over and done with. And you allow the gay images to come into your mind. You allow the urges to come into your mind. But fighting in this case isn't actually fighting or being aggressive mentally or otherwise. It's about acceptance. You accept everything that these thoughts dish out to you. And, you know, like if you're in a certain meditative position or whichever way you want to do it, and you imagine these thoughts, you might start crying, you might start cringing, you might start bawling your eyes out, you know, you might be in the fetus position, you know, you might scream out in agony, you know, which is what Billy, a friend of mine, did. He actually screamed out in agony when he was doing the ERP, but he gave himself no option. And it was actually the Stargate analogy I got from Billy, because that's what he said. He said it was like all or nothing. He said it was kind of like I give myself no option, but because in the end for him, doing the ERP was less painful than putting up the intrusive thoughts. It was less painful in a sense than putting up with a constant intrusive thoughts. Because what happens with a lot of people is a lot of people don't want to do the exposure because it's too uncomfortable for them. Okay? So what they do instead is they collect data. And they read this article and they read that article. And they scour about the internet and scour about Google, collecting information like a fucking magpie, right? And, you know, and respect to them. You've got to give these people respect because they are trying to help themselves. But what they're doing, they're going about it in, pardon the expression, but, you know, not the right way. They're collecting all this thing because they're thinking that by collecting data that they're going to change stuff. Well, here's the thing. HOCD is a mental condition, okay? It's not so much a mental condition of the conscious mind, it's a mental condition of the subconscious mind. So when they are collecting data and logical data, what they are dealing with is the wrong part of the mind. They're trying to change the conscious part, but you need to change the unconscious part at the back, so to speak. And you're not going to change the unconscious mind through collecting data. And it's like, you know, collecting data can be a compulsion, and it can be like a form of hoarding. It's like you get these OCDs that hoard everything. So you need to change the subconscious, but in order to do that, you need to face the fear. You need to go through that Stargate. And you need to do ERP. That's the way to do it. That's the way to do it. Tell you what it's like. When people do collect data instead of doing ERP, here's a great analogy. At least I think it's great anyway. Right. Imagine you were being bullied at school because OCD at the end of the day is a bully. So imagine your own childhood and imagine you got bullied at school. Perhaps some of you did, so you'd be able to relate even more to what I'm saying. So you take the long way to school because you want to avoid the bully. You get into school and then you have break time and then you have lunch. And on break time and on lunch, you're hiding behind the bins or you're hiding somewhere so that the bully won't see you. And then when the bell goes for home time, you walk the long way home so that you haven't got to bump into the bully. But guess what? Eventually, you're going to have to meet him. And you're going to have to face him. And it's better to take a couple of punches in the face than it is to put up with years of fucking bullying and take that from someone who knows. I know about that stuff because I was bullied in school. But the point I'm making is this. When you are collecting data on HOCD or OCD or whatever type you got, but you're not doing ERP, it's exactly the same as walking to school a long way to avoid the bully. What you need to do is to confront it and beat it. And you can beat it. You are stronger than you think you are. Much stronger. Much more robust than you give yourself credit for. Okay. So, let's talk about some embarrassing OCD moments. Right, when I was a kid, and I've often mentioned about early signs of OCD. When I was about 5, 6, 7 years old, I used to nod my head. I went through a phase. I went through it, I think it was a couple of times, of nodding my head. And I'd go like this, like that. And I would do it a lot. And I can remember visiting and sleeping at somebody's, one of my relatives' house, my auntie and uncles, and this is back in the 70s, like 76, 77, maybe a bit earlier. And I can remember, I think we were watching, I don't know, The Wizard of Oz, or we were watching something. And I can remember laying on the floor watching the movie and nodding my head. And I can remember getting shouted at. And because back then they didn't really understand what it was about, or what was going on. They probably thought I was seeking attention, but it was quite embarrassing. It was really embarrassing. There was another time as well, after my breakdown, when I was working nights. All I was doing with the loneliness of being on my own all the time, and of course the OCD had kicked in, and the Poirot was there with all these intrusive thoughts. I started talking to myself, and I'd go on my security walks for an hour at a time, and I would talk to myself. I felt compulsed to talk to myself, right? And there were a few occasions where I was walking past offices, going into workshops, and I was fucking talking to myself, and there were people there and I didn't know. And I started bumping into people after that, and they were, "Hi Jesse," and they were embarrassed for me, or either that, or they were just taking the piss. They were just making fun of me, but trying not to show it, because obviously word had got round in the workplace. That security guard is a fucking lunatic. He's talking to himself. That was really embarrassing, really embarrassing. And round about that time, or just after, I think, I'd gone to town in the night with some friends, and we visited a casino. We went to this casino, and I don't gamble, so I just went there to drink and to have a few sandwiches or whatever. And I went to the toilet. I went to the men's room, and I still had all these intrusive thoughts about my mother dying and all the rest of it. It was fucking horrible. I had no respite from it at all, even when I was out. And I went into the men's toilet, the men's room, and I was doing compulsions, washing my hands and touching things and all that sort of stuff. And I went out of the door of the men's room, and that didn't feel right, so I come back in, and then I went back out, and then I come back in, and I went back out, and I come back in. And if there was anybody on the security camera watching this, they were probably pissing themselves laughing, right, at what I was doing. And it was like, those like comedy clips or whatever, where you see somebody jumping into the water and they rewind it, and he jumps back out, and he jumps back in, and he jumps back out, and he jumps back in, and he jumps back out. That's what it was like. I was out the door, in the door, out the door, in the door. And after it, I felt embarrassed. I felt embarrassed while I was doing it. But it was because I was warding off these horrific thoughts. So Really, on the outside, it looked like a fucking comedy show, but on the inside, it was a horror story. And this is what I mean with Poirot and intrusive thoughts. It's such an invisible disease. Obsessive compulsive disorder is such an invisible disease that people got no fucking empathy. None. Because they don't understand it. This is why you need to be with your own, in a sense. And this is why I created the Facebook group, so that people, I don't care, you know, most of it is full of HOCD people, but it's really for everyone. And this is why I've created the group as a refuge for people. And what was very heartwarming and very touching and brought a tear to my eyes was that I did have a couple of messages from people saying that if they hadn't have found my videos, they would have taken their own life. And I just got something to say about that. Don't be fucking stupid. It's only OCD. And you can beat it. You can really beat it. What you need to do is walk hand in hand with uncertainty. Make uncertainty your life's partner. See, OCD people have got rules and regulations in their head. Okay? And it's these rules and regulations, perfectionism, etc., that is partly the cause of this. As Milton Erickson once said, people come to me because their thoughts are rigid. So it's these rules that are doing the damage. I had an internet fight with some guy. And this guy called me everything. The sheer vitriol and the acid and everything that came off him was incredible. And I just let him carry on. And he just insulted me and insulted me and insulted me. And I thought, fuck it. And I let him have it. So the first fucking words out of my mouth was your mother. And I said something to him, and I'm not really proud of it, but I said something to him along the lines of his mother's asshole needed a manhole cover or something like that. And he went absolutely ballistic. Do you know why he went ballistic? Because he had a rule in his head that says, you mustn't say anything bad about my mother. Now, he didn't care what he said to me. He didn't care about how he made me feel. But he still had this rule. And I violated it. And his emotional response was totally off the charts. As humans, as people, we have rules and regulations. And with OCD, it's no exception. So when we can't accept something, that's when the emotional distress comes in. You know, you either get angry or you get anxious. And in the case of OCD, you mainly get anxious. So when somebody has an intrusive thought about being gay, there's a rule somewhere in your head that says, I mustn't be gay, I must fancy the opposite sex, I must fancy the opposite sex. And it causes mass distress. Mass distress. You are so rigid and you need to be flexible. You know, when you put water into a glass, the water takes the shape of the glass because it's flexible. Now, back when you're a kid, you probably didn't have so many rules and regulations because your mind was more pristine. And did you suffer with anxiety as a kid? Did you suffer with stress as a kid? Probably not, because those rules and regulations hadn't been set up. And with our ERP, you're basically gently confronting the fear and allowing it to violate, in a sense, those rules and regulations. I've gone on quite long enough, and there's probably a lot of things that I've missed out. But one thing I will leave you with is make uncertainty your life partner. Walk hand in hand with uncertainty. Because it's uncertainty, and it's the road less travelled, is what's going to get you to where you need to go. Anyway, this has been a super long video. I think my audio cut out halfway through, so apologies for that. And take care, guys. I will be seeing you again. Bye.